There's this saying that goes, to remain ignorant of history is to remain forever a child. There were so many emotions that came over me while walking the gravel road towards arguably Southern Illinois' largest and most controversial incubator for salt mining. Like an infant child, I felt strong emotions of sorrow, confusion, and pain, but couldn't articulate my true feelings about things until I conducted further research. Research that will reveal old wounds from my ancestors, but also new wounds if the story is not properly addressed. This was the birth of adding salt to wounds. John Crenshaw was born November 19, 1797 in North Carolina. He and his family will remain there until about 1812 when the family relocated to New Madrid, Missouri. While they settled in Missouri, the family illegitimately claimed to be related to the 12th U.S. President Zachary Taylor to gain preferential treatment with the townspeople. By unfortunate luck, the family did not stay in Missouri very long. Less than a year after relocating, there was a massive water flood that destroyed many parts of Missouri and caused catastrophic damage. Having not many options, the Crenshaw family relocated to Equality, Illinois. John Crenshaw began to work in the salt wells, which was one of Illinois' main revenue generators at the time. He would work under various lessees at the salines until about 1825, when he was promoted to a supervisor. He would later inherit several properties from his uncle by marriage, which consisted of the plantation and the old slave house. In case you were wondering why salt was so important back then, let's travel back to the 19th century. During the 19th century, salt was essential for many people across the globe. Salt's primary usage was for food preservation. Also, salt was used as currency for global trade amongst nations. So why does this relate to Southern Illinois? In the Wildcat Hills, located in Equality, there was salt-rich water that native Indians would use for water evaporation. The Indians would use pans to execute the water evaporation and later scrape the hardened substance deposits off of the pan. This would, of course, create salt. Nearby slave masters like Crenshaw caught wind of this practice and took over. The work at the salt wells was a 24-hour operation and required hard labor. Although the work was very lucrative, it was also extremely dangerous. So, slave masters would have their slaves do it. The masters forced slaves into several labor groups consisting of saltwater gatherers, firewood choppers, and saltwater boilers to create salt. Once most of the firewood began to deplete, the U.S. government authorized enslavers to chop down trees in the forest because of how great the salt wells financially boosted the state's economy. With now having more approved land and resources for firewood, miles-long pipelines were created to collect water more quickly rather than using pans and walking for miles. This documentary wouldn't exist if the salt mining method of labor was a good one. As you can guess, John Crenshaw would use slaves to operate his salt empire. Article 6 of the 1818 Constitution, Section 1 stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall hereafter be introduced in the state, otherwise for the punishment of crimes. There was also language in Section 1 that stated that no person could be a servant under someone unless bona fide consideration was received for their services. Section 2, on the other hand, included a very specific exception for the salt wells labor. Section 2 stated that no person shall be bound to labor in this state except within the tract reserved for the salt works near Shawneetown. As you can gather, the government again allowed salt works to continue. History also indicates that slaveholders would disobey the laws and work mainly in the interest of their businesses. Thus, the state legislature would enact the 1819 Black Codes. The Black Codes, in short, were put in place to challenge every black person's citizenship and freedom regardless of their status. If a black person could not produce a freedom certificate, they would be presumed to be a runaway slave and would be jailed. Their jail fine would be upwards of $200, in which most black people didn't have at their disposal at that time. This would later lead the enslaved black person to be auctioned off by the sheriff to a new owner who would pay their fine. Forced into bondage, the slave would have to work until their fine was paid in full. In most cases, that would last for several decades or even a lifetime. Other things that the Black Codes did was restrict black people's right to own property, conduct business, buy and lease land, and move freely through public spaces. Going back to Mr. Crenshaw, not only did he lease slaves from border pro-slavery states, he also kidnapped free black people and forced them into slavery. He would do so by intercepting the path of the Underground Railroad and force them into bondage. This was known as the Reverse Underground Railroad. Once the black people were caught, the slaves were housed on the Crenshaw's land in order to keep up with the demands of the 24-hour salt whales operation. Although a great number of the slaves were kept at the old slave house, there were others that were sold to southern pro-slavery states for profit. Crenshaw would eventually be charged with the crimes of kidnapping, but never convicted for the offense due to lack of evidence. Research now points out that John Crenshaw would use an alias name, which was John Granger, where he sold slaves to slave masters in the South. Records of these transactions were found through deed books decades after their inception. For many years, Crenshaw brutalized and exploited the services of slaves. His salt whales operation was so infamous that it caught the attention of anti-slavery activists all the way up in my hometown of Chicago. One man in particular was John Jones. Jones was a wealthy black man and was a newspaper writer by trade, writing in the Western Citizen. His goal was to abolish the black codes and solicited the help of Illinois Governor Richard Yates. In 1864, the two met and discussed the issue. However, there was no resolution. The next year, in 1865, seemingly further deliberations occurred. Governor Yates did two things. He ratified the 13th Amendment in the state and repealed the Black Codes Bill at last. Eventually, the demand for salt declined near the 1840s. Crenshaw would ultimately be forced into thousands of dollars of debt. Shortly after, his health began to decline. Crenshaw would try to revitalize his salt well business for several more decades, but by 1871, he had already sold most of his land to local buyers interested in the salt wells. On December 4th, 1871, John Crenshaw passed away. His grandson, Robert Going Lampier, is the last known descendant of the land, but he would later die in 1919. As controversial as Crenshaw was, his obituary that was published in a newspaper depicted him as a smart and savvy businessman. But this comes as no surprise because racism was at an all-time high during this time period. To be free or not to be free should never be a question. Everyone deserves to live freely and fight against oppression. My heart aches when I think about my ancestors' pain. I wish that all of the salt to their wounds would be washed away with a long summer rain. After completing this short documentary, I am encouraged and not defeated. I dedicate this to my ancestors and God. Peace be upon us all. Thank you.